So for last year, only
Powered by
two players
Riverside FM.
rushed for over 200 yards. Saquon Barkley, 255, and Jonathan Taylor, who had 218. Derrick Henry came 1 yard short with 199. Welcome to Just the Stats NFL, the show that covers the NFL statistical leaders from the all-time greats to the current players leading the NFL. I'm Ernie Jennings, your host. On this show, we stick to the stats and leave the gossip to the multitude of other shows that cover the NFL. I do listen to those shows, but I wanted this show to be something different, so we have deviated from the typical NFL talk show. Today, we're going to dive into the all-time best single game leaders. This will be part one of a two-part series. So how many current players appear on this list? We're going to find out on this podcast and on the next one. At the end of the last podcast, I had a comment about who holds the record for the most passing yards in a game. It's a record that I am frankly surprised that has lasted for so long. It's 74 years to be exact. So we're going to find out right now who that person is. Let's get started with Just the Stats NFL. So we start today with passing yards in a single game. It's only happened 25 times in the history of the NFL that someone has passed for 500 or more yards in a game. Ben Roethlisberger is the only one that has appeared on this list 3 times. But he is not the number one player. The number one all-time passing leader in a single game for yards is Norm Van Brocklin, who played for the Rams. He threw for 554 yards on September 28, 1951. 1951. So we're talking 74 years ago. It's still a record that stands. The result of that game, they were playing against the New York Yanks, which was their name at the time. The Rams beat the Yanks 54-14. He was actually filling in for an injured Bob Waterfield, and he threw 5 touchdowns and also led the Rams to an NFL record 735 total yards in a single game. Quite a record. The number 2 player, unfortunately for the Jaguars, which is my team, was Matt Schaub, who played for the Houston Oilers. And he set that record in 2012 against the Jaguars. The Houston won the game 43-37 in overtime. That's the second most yards, tied with Warren Moon, in a single game. He threw for a career-high 5 touchdowns. I tell you what, the Jaguars make poor quarterbacks look good. Good quarterbacks look like all-stars. It seems to be consistent with the Jaguars as far as their pass defense goes. It's been that way for so long, and this game was in 2012. It didn't seem any different last year. We'll see how this upcoming year it goes with a new staff. But Schaub threw for 527 yards. 273 of those yards went to Andre Johnson, which makes this one of the most remarkable performances, combining a 500-yard thrower with 273 yards receiving by one player. But they ended up winning that game in overtime when Schaub threw a pass to Andre Johnson, a 48-yard game-winning touchdown in overtime to win that game. As I said, Matt Schaub was tied with Warren Moon, who also had 527 yards in 1990. That was against the Kansas City Chiefs, and the Oilers beat them 27-10. Interesting that Warren Moon played in the Canadian Football League for quite a little bit. Won 5 straight Grey Cups. It was like their Super Bowl. He went undrafted, unbelievably, but then he joined the Oilers in 1984. Obviously, he's a player that the scouts did not really appreciate, and it took him going to the Canadian Football League for them to find out how good he was. But his performance was a showcase of the Oilers' run-and-shoot offense, with almost half the yards of his 527 going to Haywood Jeffries, who had 245 yards. One was an 87-yard touchdown. So those two are tied for second with 527 yards. Current player who moved almost up the list in passing them was Joe Burrow, who in 2021 threw for 525 yards, just missing out with Matt Schaub and Warren Moon's 527. So he set the Bengals franchise record with that. He also snapped Boomer Esiason's team mark. In that game, which was against the Baltimore Ravens, the Bengals won 41-21. And unlike one player getting all the yards, Chase and Higgins both went over 100 yards receiving in that game. This game took place on December 26th. Earlier in October, Burrow had another game against the Ravens where he threw for over 400 yards. He feasted on the Ravens in 2021. Number 5 was Ben Roethlisberger, who in 2014 threw for 522 yards in a game that was against the Indianapolis Colts, with the Steelers winning 51-34. Big Ben, he threw for 6 touchdowns. He became the first player to throw for over 500 yards in 3 games. So, as I said, he's the only one that's done that. He tied Boomer Esiason, who had 522 yards in 1996. He was playing for Arizona against the Washington Redskins, and the Arizona Cardinals won that game 37-34 in overtime. This was one where he distributed the ball to 8 different receivers instead of just throwing to one particular guy. 8 different guys, none of them had more than 100 yards individually. So he really spread the ball around in that game. Dan Marino in 1988 threw for 521 yards. This one here was one of the few games where the 500-yard thrower lost the game. In that game, the Dolphins lost to the New York Jets 44-30. The bad thing about it is he threw for 521 yards, which was number 7 all time for most yards. But he also threw 5 interceptions. Who threw for over 500 yards was Matthew Stafford, threw for 520 yards in 2012. In this game, which was against the Green Bay Packers, and it was when Matthew Stafford was playing for the Detroit Lions. This is in a game that was called the Matt Flynn game, which I'll explain in a second. But it was quite an impressive game. The Lions ended up losing that 45-41, another game where the 500-yard thrower lost the game. He did set the Lions single-game passing record, of course. But he was overshadowed in some ways by Matt Flynn, who ended up throwing 6 touchdown passes. It was called a Matt Flynn game because it earned him a contract with the Seattle Seahawks for $26 million. But unfortunately for Seattle, he never replicated the success that he had in this particular game. So that's why it's called the Matt Flynn game. Number 9 was Jared Goff, who threw for 517 yards in 2019, another active player. This is, again, a loss. He was 55-40 loss to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Goff threw for a career-high 517 yards and tied the NFL record at the time with 45 completions. That's an incredible amount of completions. He also happened to throw 3 interceptions, which contributed to the loss. Number 10, Tom Brady also had 517 yards in 2011 when he threw for those yards. He had 4 touchdowns in that game, which was against Miami Dolphins, and they won that game. Patriots beat Miami 38-24. So those are the top 10 of the players that threw for 500 plus yards. Let's look at a couple current players that are farther down the list. Kirk Cousins, for example, who is sitting out of training camp at the moment with the Atlanta Falcons. Don't know what's going to happen with him this year. But last year, amazingly, before he was benched in favor of the rookie quarterback, he threw for 509 yards on October 3rd, 2024, against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Falcons won that game 36-30 in overtime. He broke the single game passing record on the night that Matt Ryan was inducted in the team's Ring of Honor. He broke his record of most passing yards in a single game that Matt Ryan held. When you look at this game, it's interesting because It was such an anomaly. Prior to this game, he hadn't thrown for more than 241 yards in a game. This is the fifth game of the season, so the first four, his highest total was 241 yards. After this game, he broke 300 yards just once, and that was in the 10th game of the season. So he really didn't have any other game that compared to this one particular game. And then by the 15th game, he was benched in favor of the rookie Michael Penix. And as I've said, he's not going to be starting this year, and he's not even showing up for voluntary training right now. We'll see how that goes with them. And then the final person is Dak Prescott, who is 25th on this list of the 25 times that somebody threw for 500 yards. In 2020, Dak Prescott threw for 502 yards against the Cleveland Browns. The Browns won that game, though, 49-38, despite the fact that Prescott had a remarkable performance, throwing for the 502 yards and having 4 touchdowns. What's interesting also about this game, and the reason I pointed it out, was that this was the game that helped Prescott set a record for the first quarterback in NFL history to pass for at least 450 yards in 3 consecutive games. So over those games, he amassed a record-setting yardage of 1,424 passing yards, the most in any 3-game span in history. So there's 5 active quarterbacks that make this list of 25. We'll see how it goes this year when we look at the quarterbacks and see if anybody can even get close to the same amount of yardage that you saw back then. Let's look at the 2024 season and see what quarterbacks had the most yards in a single season in 2024. All right, let's look at the quarterbacks last year who threw for the most yards in a single game. And of course, that was led off by Kirk Cousins, who did break the 500-yard mark. Jameis Winston came very close with 497 yards. He was second. And then Jared Goff, as we mentioned, who made the list with a 500-yard game already in 2019, he passed for 494 yards, so almost had another 500-yard game. Joe Burrow was fourth with 424. And Jared Goff also showed up seventh with 412. So he had 2 400-yard games. Jameis Winston had that 497-yard game and a 395-yard game. So he had a couple of big games. Same with Joe Burrow, had 3 games of 392 or more yards. So impressive seasons, but only one quarterback was able to break the 500-yard mark. All right, let's look at next passing touchdowns, the most in a single game. And that's held by Sid Luckman. This is another record. Amazingly, it's even older than the most yards in a single game. Though this record has been tied 8 times. So there have been current players who have matched it, or players who have played recently who have matched it, but no one's been able to break it. Sid Luckman had 7 touchdowns in 1943. So he was the first quarterback to throw for 7 touchdowns in a game, leading the Bears to a 56-7 rout of the New York Giants. Sid Luckman was named the NFL MVP that season. 11 years later, Adrian Burke had 7 touchdowns in 1954 in a win with his Philadelphia Eagles over the Washington Redskins at the time. So he had 7 touchdowns, completed 19 passes, and 7 of them were for touchdowns. Pretty incredible. And George Blanda, who is famous for leading the NFL in interceptions, he also, though, is one of those who threw for a lot of touchdowns. He was playing for the Houston Oilers against the New York Titans. George Blanda, in 1961, in a game against the New York Titans, threw for 7 touchdowns in a victory, 49-13. George Blanda holds a lot of records for interceptions. He also holds the longest pro career with 26 seasons serving as a kicker and a quarterback. In 1962, just a year later, Y.A. Tittle threw 7 touchdowns. This was in a victory over the Washington Redskins of his team, the New York Giants, of 49-34. He had 7 touchdowns, 500 yards passing, and a near perfect passer rating of 151. Joe Kapp in 1969 had 7 touchdowns in a victory by his Minnesota Vikings over the Baltimore Colts. This game helped propel the Minnesota Vikings to their first NFL championship game in 1969. Joe Kapp, in a little interesting fact, is the only player to ever quarterback in a Super Bowl, a Rose Bowl, and a Grey Cup. The Grey Cup being like the Super Bowl of the Canadian Football League. So you have the first 5 players from 1943 to 1969. Then you go until 2013 when Peyton Manning was the next player to throw for 7 touchdowns in a single game, which he did in September 5th, 2013. It was the season opener for the Denver Broncos, and they beat the Baltimore Ravens 49-27. In this game, Manning tied that record, which had been 44 years since the last player had thrown for 7 touchdowns. This became part of the season where he also had the season record for touchdowns in 55. Another quarterback that the Jaguars thought was going to be great and wasn't was Nick Foles. In 2013, he threw for 7 touchdowns. Same year as Peyton Manning, 2 times in the same season. He had a perfect passer rating, completed 22 passes, so 7 of them were for touchdowns, and threw for over 400 yards in that game on 22 completions. This was against the Oakland Raiders, and this happened to be the same year that the Eagles won the Super Bowl, where Nick Foles, was named the Super Bowl MVP. It's going to be later that the Jaguars pick him up, but and he didn't do much for them. This was the highlight, basically, of his career, I would say. And the final player who threw for 7 touchdowns, which was 10 years ago, was Drew Brees, threw for 7 TDs in 2015. He also, at the same game, threw for over 500 yards, 510 yards, along with his 7 touchdowns. This game, which I recently watched on NFL Plus, was incredible. He threw for 7 touchdowns. He actually threw for 8 touchdowns if you count the fact that he threw a pick 6 in this game. So he had 7 touchdowns for his team, 1 for the other team. And at the same time, this game was a 52-49 shootout win over the New York Giants. Eli Manning himself threw for 6 touchdowns. So they combined for an NFL record 13 passing touchdowns in a single game. It was a back and forth game. By the end of the first quarter, Drew Brees had 253 yards passing. So basically, in the final 3 quarters, he gets the second half of his 510 yards. But it was an incredible game. So those are the only players who have thrown for 7 touchdowns. No one's been able to break that record. Let's look at touchdowns in this 2024 season. Here's Jared Goff again. We had 8 players throw for 5 touchdowns in a game last year. So 5 was the most. Lamar Jackson did it twice. And then you had Jared Goff, Joe Burrow, Baker Mayfield, Sam Darnold, like I said, Jackson twice. Jaden Daniels, a rookie. He's an incredible rookie. Joe Burrow is twice on the list. Those were the only players to throw for 5 touchdowns. Then you had a lot of players throw for 4. Let's look at passes intercepted. The leader in that is Jim Hardy in 1950, who threw 8 interceptions in a single game. The only player to throw for 8 in a game. You also then have 5 players who threw 7 interceptions in a game. So those are the most interceptions in a game. See if anybody this year comes near to breaking any of these records. The interception record, I doubt seriously, will get broken. But some of the other ones, passing yards, passing TDs, would have a better shot. Hardy threw 8 picks in a 45-7 loss against the Philadelphia Eagles. He was playing for the Chicago Cardinals at that time. Maybe part of the reason he had such a difficult game, he arrived late to the game. He was in a car accident that game, was unprepared, and He had already thrown 3 interceptions by halftime. He was briefly benched but came back in the game. What's crazy about that is that the very next week, and I guess that shows what being prepared does for you, but the next week he threw 6 touchdowns, 5 TDs to 1 player. Those players that have thrown for 7 interceptions were Zeke Bratkowski in 1960, Tommy Wade, 1965, Ken Stabler for the Oakland Raiders against the Denver Broncos. He had a difficult game against them, throwing 7 picks. Oakland was on a 17-game winning streak when that happened. So Steve DeBerg in 1986, and then the most recent player, which has been 24 years since anybody has thrown 7 interceptions, but Ty Detmer did. He was playing for the Detroit Lions against the Cleveland Browns. Looking at 2024, we see that there was 6 quarterbacks that threw for 3 interceptions in a single game. So obviously nowhere near 7. I would think you'd been pulled long before you threw the 7th interception, unless your other guy was hurt or something. But topping the list off is who is in today's game one of the most prolific interception throwers is Jameson Winston. He had 3. Jordan Love and Baker Mayfield had 3. Geno Smith and Joe Flacco had 3, and then Mason Rudolph. Those are the only ones that threw for 3 interceptions. Shifting from the quarterbacks to the running backs, let's look at the leading rushers in a single game. The leading rusher is Adrian Peterson, who had 296 yards in a single game. This was back in November 4th of 2007 against the San Diego Chargers. He was playing for the Minnesota Vikings. Vikings ended up winning that game 35-17. Not only did he rush for that many yards, he also did it as a rookie. He beat out the record for the number 2 player, which is Jamal Lewis of the Baltimore Ravens, who had 295 yards. So he broke the record by 1 yard. In 2003, Jamal Lewis had those 295 yards against the Cleveland Browns. The Ravens ended up winning that game 33-13. Another player, Jerome Harrison, he was number 3. He had 286 yards against the Kansas City Chiefs in 2009. The Browns ended up winning that one 41-34. And what's crazy about that game is he had 286 yards in that one game. He ended up compiling his entire career less than 1,700 yards. Corey Dillon in 2000 had 278 yards in a Cincinnati Bengals victory over the Denver Broncos. He had 22 carries for that 278 yards, which was almost 13 yards a carry. He had 2 touchdowns. It was quite an impressive game. Cincinnati ended up totaling over 400 yards on the ground in that particular game. Walter Payton Sweetness for the Chicago Bears had 275 yards in 1977 against the Minnesota Vikings. Very close game. Bears ended up winning that game 10-7. Walter Payton went into the game with the flu, had a fever over 101, carried the ball 40 times for his 275 yards and the only touchdown that the Bears had. But just showed his dedication to the Bears going into that game, not feeling well at all. O.J. Simpson had 273 yards in 1976 against the Detroit Lions. He's playing for the Buffalo Bills. Now, this was a game where they lost. The Lions beat the Bills 27-14. O.J. Simpson, he had an amazing ability to run, considering that the defenses just sat there and waited for him. In this particular game, it was 273 yards for the team. That was 89% of the Buffalo's entire offense in that one player. I don't know another game where one player dominated the offense in that manner, to that extent. So you had a total of 15 times that a player had 250 or more yards. And I say that because, for example, O.J. Simpson had 250 and 273 yards. So he's on the list twice. Derrick Henry had 250 yards in 2021. He's one of the active players with 250 yards. And the last one I would mention was a player named Spec Sanders for the New York Yanks in 1947, had 250 yards. What makes that interesting, he was pulled in the third quarter from the game because they were winning 28-7, and he was pulled from the game. So you can imagine if he had played the whole fourth quarter as well on the pace he was on, he could have went over 300 yards, but they pulled him. So we'll never know how many yards he could have possibly got. So like I said, 16 times somebody's gotten 250 or more yards. Let's look at current players and see what they had for this last year. So as I forgot to mention, I think was Saquon Barkley had 255 yards just this last year. So for active players, he's currently the highest total amount of yards in a single game. He comes in at number 9. Jonathan Taylor is right behind him with 253 yards, which he did in 2021. And then Derrick Henry had 250 also in 2021. And incredibly, on the same day that Jonathan Taylor did. Unfortunately, again, another total where the Jaguars on the wrong end of it. Jonathan Taylor for the Indianapolis Colts had his 253 yards against the Jaguars on January 3rd, 2021, same day that Derrick Henry was piling up his 250 yards for the Tennessee Titans against the Houston Texans. So for last year, only 2 players rushed for over 200 yards. Saquon Barkley, 255, and Jonathan Taylor, who had 218. Derrick Henry came 1 yard short with 199. And then you had, which is interesting, you have Jonathan Taylor again with 177 and Saquon Barkley again with 176. Coming in at 8th was Derrick Henry again with 169. And then here's Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, Saquon Barkley. So you can see the big numbers came from basically the same players. The only one that broke this top 11 list was Dameon Pierce, who came in at 6th with 176 yards for the Houston Texans against Tennessee in a game that Houston won 23-14. Bijan Robinson had 170 yards, but you could just see the domination of Barkley, Taylor, and Henry. Jonathan Taylor can stay healthy. He is as good as those other two or close to it. I mean, Derrick Henry is an incredible athlete, stays so healthy. And I expect another good year out of him this coming year. Let's look at running backs with their touchdown totals. So there's only five running backs with 5 or more touchdowns in a single game. It's not something that you see regularly. That's a lot of touchdowns in a single game. Alvin Kamara had 6 rushing touchdowns. He's the only player with 6 in a single game. And he did that not too long ago, 5 years ago in 2020 against the Minnesota Vikings. He's playing, of course, for the New Orleans Saints. And this was on Christmas Day that he rushed for these yards. Now, Ernie Nevers is credited with 6 touchdowns as well, but he played in a game in 1929. The reason he doesn't show up on the official records is that stats were not kept accurately back then. And so they're basing it off what they read in newspapers, that type of thing. And I guess they don't consider it accurate. So Alvin Kamara had 6 TDs. Clinton Portis, James Stewart, Cookie Gilchrist, and Jim Brown all had 5 TDs. I do remember the game James Stewart against the Eagles when he had his 5 touchdowns, where the Jaguars won 38-21 over the Eagles. That was one of the rare moments when you have a Jaguar on top versus the one that's the record's being set against. Jim Brown was the first player to have the 5 TDs, if you don't count Ernie Nevers, in 1959, playing for the Cleveland Browns against the Colts. He had 5 TDs. He rushed for 178 yards. This was an upset win for the Browns, 38-31 over the Colts, who were the defending champions of the NFL. Looking at rushing TDs this last year, and as I said, 5 or 6 is the highest totals we've seen, and that's only been done 5 times. The best was several players with 3 TDs last year. Jonathan Taylor and Alvin Kamara again had 3 TDs, who holds the record with 6. And then you have one quarterback, Josh Allen. You would think it could have been Hurts, but it wasn't. It was Josh Allen. He had 3 TDs last year in a loss, actually, to the Los Angeles Rams, 44-42. So Josh Jacobs, Joe Mixon, and then you have the multi-dimensional player of Taysom Hill for New Orleans, who had 3 touchdowns in a game against the Cleveland Browns, and then Jamar Gibbs. So those were your top players with 3. That's the most. Not too many players ever get close in the touchdown category. Next time, we'll be looking at the single game leaders in receiving, scoring, and on defense. So I look forward to bringing that podcast to you at the next time. So we'll finish off at that point the all-time single game leader records. Thank you for listening to Just the Stats NFL, and I look forward to the next podcast. Please subscribe, and I appreciate that. Thank you.